So Earl and I were talking earlier about how I grew up first in Iowa and then in Minnesota and the weather that they've been having up there earlier. I talked to my mom just recently on Christmas Day. They had a high of, I think she said it was 9 below for the high there. And I've been thinking about winters a lot with the snowstorms they had in New York City and across the Midwest, and feeling a lot of compassion for those folks. I grew up, after I was from the years of being 12 years old to 18, I lived on what used to be a dairy farm in Minnesota. And in Minnesota, it was a common practice for dairy farmers that at the first sign of a winter storm, they would go to the barn, they would bring all the cows into the barn so they weren't out in the pastures. And then they would tie a rope to the barn door and stretch it back to the back door of the house, so that when they had to do the milking, and as the blizzard was raging and there was a whiteout outside, you could hold on to the rope as you got to the barn and back so that you wouldn't get lost. Because we had heard lots of stories about farmers who had gone out to do the milking and in the middle of a whiteout could not find their way back to the house. It saved many souls from getting lost. Today I'm using a metaphor. I'm using the blizzard and the rope as metaphors, and thinking about all the ways, all the kinds of blizzards that we have in our lives today, not just weather patterns, but the kinds of things that can pull us off track of being our best selves and of living our core values. What gets you off track? Are you tempted to make New Year's resolutions to stay on track this year? My colleague, the Reverend Karen Anderson, asked members of her congregation that question a few years ago. She said, what gets you off track in your life? Pulls you away from that central rope that is your core values. And here are some of the things that they said. Allowing somebody else's opinions to affect my actions. Not feeling valued. Feeling inadequate. Feeling the need to protect myself from the judgment of others. My own self-criticism. In other words, some sort of fear of something, fear of success, fear of failure, fear of other people's judgments, fear that one's own decisions are going to bring consequences that were unintended. Fear is in fact what pulls most of us off of that rope of best intentions, of being centered in our core values. Today is the first day of a new year, 2023, and often we decide that we're going to make resolutions to better ourselves in some way this time of year. We think of stuff that we can add to our already busy routines to correct our irksome flaws, our crazy behaviors. I read yesterday a really interesting suggestion in the New York Times, where they said, here's a fun thing to do for your New Year's Eve party. Everybody write down on a slip of paper a New Year's resolution they want to make, put it in a hat, and then everybody draws somebody else's resolution. And then you have to try to live up to that resolution somebody else made that year. And I thought to myself, well, that's probably going to work just about as well as the resolutions we try to make for ourselves. Because in fact, it's been shown that about 88% of New Year's resolutions fail. 88%. Whether it's due to a lack of motivation, or a lack of resources, or a loss of interest, the task of bettering ourselves seems to evaporate over time, leaving us with feeling even worse about ourselves in most situations because we haven't lived up to our own expectations. Fearful that we just don't have what it takes to commit ourselves to something that will better our lives. Well, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think maybe a reframing is needed about New Year's resolutions. Maybe the answer is not in self-improvement, but in rediscovering our center. In other words, what would help us hold on to that rope that is at the core of our being? And that, my friends, is very conscious spiritual work. It's very different from just making New Year's resolutions. When I was here back in November, I talked about the importance of transitions in our lives, and I said that there are 3 steps to any transition. There is the first step of consciously leaving behind what will not serve us in the next stage of life. The next step is entering a liminal space where we have given up who we were, but we're not quite ready to take on the mantle of being who we want to become. And then the third stage is doing whatever we need to do to create a sustainable vision for the future. So those 3 steps. I see now New Year's Day as being kind of a mini transition time where rather than just making a new resolution, adding something to our already busy schedules, it might serve us to begin by thinking about those 3 stages and letting go first of something that doesn't serve us. And maybe that would give us room to create something new. The Jewish calendar ends in the fall with a period of deep reflection called Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur. It is a time when people consider what debts need to be paid, what people need to be forgiven, what you yourself may need to be forgiven for, and asking for forgiveness. The traditional theology around that time is that at the end of that year, God closes the book on our year and judges us for what we have or have not accomplished as far as those steps of forgiveness and debts that we might have accumulated. I have a different theological perspective, and that is grounded in the belief in a divine mystery that desires us to lead the most joyful, most unencumbered lives. And this requires that we be emotionally alive. What does it mean to be emotionally alive? Being emotionally alive doesn't mean that we're always happy, but it does mean that we are able to experience our positive emotions and our negative emotions in their true, I don't know what you want to call it. as they hit us, right? That we don't try to hold anything back. It doesn't mean we need to act out of our emotions, but it means we need to feel our emotions, to be emotionally alive. I think that oftentimes as we accumulate life experiences, as we've had failures, betrayals, griefs, our zest for life, our optimism, creates this kind of ever-growing emotional numbness because we're afraid to feel those negative emotions. We feel like we shouldn't have those emotions. And often this emotional numbness, I think, is due to the fact that we haven't done this letting go of what has been holding us back. We have not taken the time to figure out what it is that's pulling us off center, keeping us from leading fully emotional lives. There's a man that I've studied this past fall named Ron Pevney, who's done extensive work around transitioning through life passages. And he writes that there are 3 processes to consider when you're severing yourself from who you've been in the past. The first thing is to do the, he calls all 3 together. He calls it a life review process. Life review process. And together they help heal your past so that you can empower your future. It means that you go into that next stage of life without having any regrets. So here are the 3 things that life review includes. The first is to work on forgiving and being forgiven. And often this includes forgiving ourselves, which is probably even in some cases more difficult than forgiving others. Forgiving yourself for not having been true to yourself in particular ways. Why is this important? I think often we forget that the lack of forgiveness hurts us. It rarely affects the other person that we're upset with. I know for myself, this is really difficult for me because if I'm angry with someone who has really betrayed me and treated me badly, I feel like somehow if I hold on to that it justifies what, my feelings about what they did. But there's a Buddhist saying that holding on to resentment when someone has hurt you is like picking up a hot coal and holding it in your hand until you have the first opportunity to throw it at the person who hurt you. But all that time that you're holding it, you're only hurting yourself. You're not doing anything to the person that has caused you harm. So work at putting down the coal. Try to forgive. And then the second task is to grieve what has been lost. Again, trying to let go of resentment for anybody, toward anybody who has caused that grief. And also to grieve what it is that you are thinking about letting go of this year. If you've had some significant losses this year, that's going to be really hard, and that will take some time, I know. But acknowledge the importance of doing that so that you can grow past the experience of grieving. And then the third task that Pevney talks about is the rewriting of disempowering stories. Begin by recalling key experiences that have affected your life this year. And ask yourself, what lessons did you learn and what messages about yourself did you receive from those experiences? What stories from your childhood might have gotten triggered? What new stories about yourself were created Stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves have a very strong magnetic quality, so that while the core of our being is being developed, those stories become the lens through which we see everything. Anybody, can you think of a story that you told yourself from way back when you were a child that still affects the way you see yourself today? If so, take some time to think about whether that story was actually true, whether it had any basis in fact, and maybe recreate it, retell that story for yourself. If you've never done this kind of spiritual work, the forgiving, the grief work, the reimagining of your stories, it might be helpful to look at your life in 6 to 7 year blocks of time and do that work for each of those blocks. You can't do a whole lifetime at once. But last fall, I went to a workshop where the participants were encouraged to every day look at their life in 6 to 10 year blocks of time and do that kind of work, so that we could clear ourselves, clear our emotional lives from a lot of baggage. And then what I want to do this year is try to do that work for just this year. Who do I need to forgive? What am I grieving? What stories have gotten triggered, and what stories do I need to reimagine for this year? I want to make this an annual ritual now. And even, you might want to even do this work every morning. Take 15 minutes every day and think about the previous day. Who do I need to forgive? What am I grieving? What would I do differently? What kind of regrets do I have from yesterday? And do what you can to try to alleviate that. Spiritual health requires this kind of regular spiritual cleansing. I'm going to start calling it spiritual hygiene. And each new year, what I've done in the past, and I want to ritualize this even further this year, I want to do this kind of work, figure out what's kept me fearful, what has triggered me, what internal stories have pulled me off center. And I'm here with you this morning, so I'm not doing this morning, but I think this afternoon, usually what I do on New Year's Day, and I will do this afternoon, is that I will, Karen and I will take down our Christmas tree, and I'll take it out into the backyard and cut it up into pieces and start a bonfire. And in that bonfire, I will put the pieces of the Christmas tree, and then also other items that represent things that I'm letting go of this year. I always find that the Christmas tree is a beautiful image, or a beautiful metaphor for the kinds of things that once brought me great joy, but have outlived their usefulness. So whatever it is that once brought me joy, but now has outlived its usefulness, I will try to burn in the fire this afternoon. And then I will spend some time just watching the fire in liminal space, and tomorrow morning I will start figuring out what it is I want the new year to be like in order to align it with my highest ideals and my deepest yearnings. So whether you are called to do something like this, I would encourage you to think about a couple of things as you think about the year to come. First one is, please hang out with your favorite people as much as you can. And this seems like a simple idea, but it's not always what we do. Why is it we tend to spend time with people who are judgmental of us, maybe even narrow-minded, people who don't really care about us, don't like us, help us write stories about ourselves that are not positive? So try to hang out with the people who believe in you, who will support you, who will remind you of your unique and very special qualities, including the kinds of things that lead them to love you as they do. So hang out with your favorite people. And secondly, hang loose regarding any plans you make this year. So often we can convince ourselves that the strategy we've worked out for ourselves is the best one. But remember the story about the pig? Remember the guru who was so convinced that the pig's life would be miserable and meaningless? Sometimes we can't know what's going to hold meaning for us until we get there. So don't hold too tightly to your plans for this coming year. Anne Morrow wrote, "I want a central core to my life that will enable me to carry out obligations and activities as well as I can. I want, in fact, to borrow from the language of the saints, to live in grace as much of the time as possible." I'm not using the term in strictly a theological sense, but by grace I mean an inner harmony, essentially spiritual, which can be translated into outer harmony. I am seeking perhaps what Socrates asked for when he said, "May the outward and inward be at one." I would like to achieve a state of inner spiritual grace from which I could function and give as I was meant to. Anne Morrow Limburg. To give as I was meant to. In the end, that is all that is really ever asked of us, is that we give as we were meant to. And although it may sound simple, it will occupy you for at least one lifetime. May each of you be blessed with the freedom to affirm your wild, wonderful, emotional selves in this new year. Amen, and blessed be.